Hello, you're listening to the latest season of the COVID Inquiry podcast. This week, Nicola is joined by Lorelei King, actor, screenwriter, narrator, and most pertinently, a member of the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice group. Together, they're going to reflect on how the recent hearings went and look forward to the next few days of evidence. Please note, some listeners may find the contents of this podcast distressing.
Hello everyone, I am Nicola Brook and I am the solicitor at BJC with day-to-day responsibility for managing our work on the COVID inquiry on behalf of the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK. I'm joined today by my co-host Lorelei King, who is a member of the group having sadly lost her husband to COVID. Joining us today to discuss the hearings this week are Allison Munroe KC and Anna Morris KC. Both are members of our council team. Allison is a criminal defence, public law and human rights barrister. She regularly represents bereaved in inquests and public inquiries and was part of the legal team for the families in the Hillsborough inquests and the Grenfell Tower inquiry. Allison represented us this week on Wednesday at the Module 4 preliminary hearing, and she's also our lead KC on Module 3, which is looking at the impact of the pandemic on healthcare. Anna Morris KC worked with Pete Weatherby and I for the past six years on the Manchester Arena inquiry and the COVID inquiry. Anna also represented families on Hillsborough. She led our team on Module 2, so attended this week for the special hearing that was convened to hear the evidence of Simon case. Welcome, everyone.
Hi, everyone. I'm so glad you're here. I'm kind of in awe of all this, all these amazing women and two KCs. It's so nice to see everyone because we haven't done a podcast in a while because the inquiry moved to the devolved nations. I just want to give a shout out to Northern Ireland. They did a podcast. It was fantastic, and it let me kind of keep up with things because I could follow that way. So it was really strange being back at Dorland House, and I thought maybe we'd touch on it chronologically, touching first on Wednesday, which was the Module 4 day, the second preliminary hearing for Module 4, which is vaccines and therapeutics. Quite a few CPs, 33. And I just want to say initially how impressed I was at how well attended it was. Often the public gallery is empty, but those vaccine injured and bereaved groups are very engaged. I have not seen it so full since the former Prime Minister was there. The hearing, as I think people who are involved in that module know, that the Module 4 has been delayed until January. And what they said, what Hugo Key said on the day, was because the impact on material providers due to the short periods of time between modular hearings. And I just wanted to, this seems to be a theme that comes up again and again, and I wonder what you all thought, because they dictate the time, do they not?
Yeah, so at the outset, Hugo Keith acknowledged the fact that the Module 4 evidential hearings were due to go ahead in July, and that has been pushed back to January. He acknowledged that that has caused distress and apologised for it, but explained that that was because material providers were struggling to meet deadlines because they were having to work on both Module 3 and Module 4 at the same time. But yeah, you're right that they set the deadlines. And we can see from updates that many of the material providers are given months and months and months to reply. So in the updates, Hugo told us that 120 requests have been sent out for Rule 9 witness statements. Well, so far, we've only been provided with 4 witness statements. So there's still a hell of a long way to go in terms of getting that disclosure, both to the inquiry and then from the inquiry to us so that we can do our job.
He said something else, and this kind of harks back to Module 2, and I'd like to ask all of you your opinion. He mentioned they're going to have what he calls a targeted approach to documents. I'm not entirely sure what that means. It just sounds to me like limiting the number. But what he said that was interesting was he said it was the same in Module 2, and the CPs objected at first And then, and I quote, generally recognized that the inquiry secured absolutely everything that matters or mattered for Module 2. I just wanted to ask each of you, do you agree? Allison, do you think that's true?
Well, I wasn't on Module 2, so Anna may be better placed to answer that. But just generally on this point, I have to echo what Nicola said, because you've got a really strange situation that the material providers dictate everything, really. They're setting the pace, they set the deadlines, and they set the parameters of what you actually see. And it should be the other way around. I mean, that's the whole point. And it's already been rejected, the idea of position statements. So effectively, you've got these material providers, and we don't see the rule nines. So you've got these material providers under no pressure, really, because no one is pressurizing them in terms of when they provide the material, what they provide, and how they provide it. And so you get this situation that disclosure is piecemeal. And we'd set out in our Module 4 preliminary hearing written submissions the actual percentage of material that's provided and when it's provided. And of course, most of it is provided, or the vast majority is provided very close to the start of the actual module. So people are constantly playing catch up. And you have ludicrous situations such as we finished module 1 and we were still getting disclosure. Nicola was still having these documents sent that she'd pass on, and it was just absolutely ludicrous. So, I mean, I don't know. I don't quite understand what he means by targeted disclosure either, because how, if you don't know what they're going to give you, how are you going to confirm that it's targeted? Again, you're wholly reliant on the material provider deciding what's targeted, and I just don't quite understand why they don't grasp the fact that they need to be in charge. The inquiry needs to be in charge. CTI needs to be the ones dictating the terms to the material providers, not the other way around. But I'll hand over to Anna in terms of what happened in Module 2 and whether or not this targeted disclosure approach was as successful as Mr. Keith King's counsel seems to think it was.
Yes, Anna, you were our KC on Module 2. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, Alison's exactly right. If the process is dictated to by the material providers, how do you know whether any approach is working or not? We are completely reliant on the CTI telling us whether something is working. I think to suggest that we would agree with that is difficult, given we don't know what we've been dealing with. So going back to basics, as Allison said, we don't know what's been asked for. We don't know what's been communicated by the material providers in terms of what's a reasonable request, what more is out there. We're in the dark. We only know what CTI tell us. So I think it's a stretch to say that we would agree that their approach was successful. I think what could be said is that they became clearer about what they were getting, what they weren't getting towards the end of Module 2. Their communication improved throughout that module, which was a benefit. But I fundamentally still think the system is the same, and that without seeing the Rule 9s and without understanding, we're now being told in other modules, for example, that we're not going to receive the experts' letters of instructions or the report until they're finalised. And so we're still in the dark about what's being asked about experts, what's being asked of material providers. So I don't think it's fair to say it's the case that we would agree that it's been successful. And Module 2 disclosure kept going down to the wire as well, that we'd be getting things the night before someone was being called to give evidence. Rule 10s were being approved or not approved the night before people were giving evidence. It was still piecemeal until the very last minute in Module 2 as well.
I mean, it's not my field, but as Allison said, the material providers are under no pressure, but it seems to me that our lawyers are all under pressure. That's what it comes down to. Nicola, getting back to Module 4, can you just tell us a little bit about what it will be looking at? I mean, I caught some of it: decision-making, misinformation, and disinformation. What else did they say they were going to cover?
So in terms of the scope, we've been told that they will look at vaccine safety, but they won't make determinations on whether a specific vaccine was safe or not, or whether it caused or contributed to an injury or death. It's very difficult to look at the development and rollout of a vaccine or a therapeutic and mark it as a success or not without looking at the impact it had on the people who were given it. And there just seems to be this division where Hugo Keith is saying nothing will fall between the gaps, but I just don't see how you can assess the success of a vaccine or a medication purely by looking at the speed at which it was developed and the rollout without looking at the impact it had on the people who were given it or the people who should have had it but didn't get access to it. And that's a point that the clinically vulnerable group made, that there's a very big difference between eligibility and access. And they said that they are able to provide the inquiry with a whole raft of examples where people were eligible for a specific vaccine or medication but couldn't get access to it, and the tragic consequences that led to. Which brings me on to the impact evidence. Hugo said that Module 4 would deal with impact evidence in exactly the same way as it did in Module 2, which means, I'm afraid, that we will have one person giving evidence on behalf of our group as a representative. And Allison, you really picked this up so well and made the point that we have 7,000 members in our group. Within that, we obviously have a myriad of members who can speak to their lived experience, but also their professional experience. You know, our group includes such a wide range of professions, and they are all able to speak on this. And so far, the inquiry is saying that it doesn't need to hear from them.
That really struck me as well. I was in the room, and when he made this point, it's the same in all the modules, I think, where he said, people can only ever report from their individual experience, and that is insufficient to establish failings. But everything is individual experience. And when he said that, there was just this restlessness, this ripple went through the gallery. And I'm not surprised. Allison, you must agree. This is an ongoing dispute we seem to have with the inquiry.
The problem I have quite often with the inquiry is that they define terms in a very limited way, such as just going back to the point of success. For them, success is they've defined it simply as, oh well, it was we found a vaccine and we rolled it out quite quickly. That's a success. Well, that's not success. That's the start of the process. The actual success is whether or not, having rolled it out, that people were able to have access to it, that those who did have access to it, that it was successful for them. It's like saying that the NHS is successful because they've sent me a letter saying you've got an appointment for your operation. That's not a success. The success is if the operation takes place and I'm better at the end of it. So they limit their terms. And then because they limit their terms and they're working in these very small parameters, but, it's a big tick. And it's the same with, well, it's not the same. It's the same and it's different with the whole thing about impact evidence, because they simply don't see it as evidence. They see it as, oh, well, let's sit there and, we'll all be sad for half an hour while we listen to people telling their sad stories. And then we move on to the actual evidence, the real, hard evidence that's actually important for the inquiry, which is very, very disrespectful and insulting to our families. And B, it misses the point that, of course, that's evidence. You wouldn't, in any other setting, a judge wouldn't say your lived experience of this particular, but for some reason they don't view that as evidence. And sort of using Grenfell as an example, it was the exact opposite, because I remember really, really well in our very first preliminary hearing on that, which was only a few months after the fire. because that inquiry was set up so quickly, that Mike Mansfield stood up and said, I'm sure you're going to hear lots of evidence from building contractors and fire experts, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But at the core of this inquiry has to be the evidence from the families, because that's their evidence, their experience, the survivors, the bereaved, those who lived in the walkways, their experience of not just the night, but the build-up and the years before and the aftermath is the hard evidence for this inquiry. And the inquiry, in fairness to them, they took that on board. And many, 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 many of our family members gave evidence. And it was probably some of the most powerful, impactful and important evidence. And just lastly, Hugo said something yesterday that annoyed me slightly as well. Well, it didn't annoy me, but I thought was wrong when he talked about systemic failings and how, when one, in order to look at systemic failings, we have to look at the hard evidence, the policies, the practices, and somehow our impact evidence isn't relevant to that. And again, that's the inquiry making a very limited definition of what a systemic failing is, because surely in order to look at a systemic failing, you have to see how it impacted. How did that system or how did that particular process impact on the individuals? And you only can do that if you hear the individuals' stories. So again, I think they're just missing the point, and they're just missing a real vital, there's like this huge lacuna now that's developing in this inquiry that you're not hearing from people during the actual hearings. And it's all very well having, the listening exercises and every story matters, etc. But that's not evidence in the inquiry. And it should be, your story, everybody's story should have the same status as a government minister, as a local authority person, as a manager of an NHS hospital, or the Prime Minister or the Deputy Prime Minister. But they have this sort of hierarchy, I'm afraid, of evidence and who's important and who's not important. Or that's certainly the perception that people quite understandably may take away because of the way in which they've framed things.
I think you made that point really well in the opening submission yesterday when you said that our evidence, individual stories, it's not for mawkish or maudlin reasons. You said it's concrete evidence. We have evidence. Anna.
Yeah, I wanted to really echo that, but it's a really interesting point, I think, that all public inquiries have to grapple with. Who identifies systemic failings? Is it data analysts? Is it the chief executive of an organisation? Is it a government minister, or is it the people on the ground with the lived experience of the disaster, of the failings, of the hospital treatment? You look at it in Hillsborough, you look at it in the post office inquiry. Who is it that identified systemic failings in the Horizon system? Ultimately, who were the ones who put the pieces together, and who were the ones who identified the systemic failings? It was not Fujitsu, it was not the post office, it was individual lived experiences connecting with each other and fighting a narrative that said, you're the only one. So when we're talking about systems failings, as Allison points out, the orthodoxy is they are for certain echelons of legal and political society to identify and tell us about. But that's not what history tells us. History tells us that people with lived experiences speak and identify to systemic failings. And if we listen to them properly and hear their evidence as evidence, that is how miscarriages of justice are identified. That's how systemic failings are identified. That's how lessons are properly learned. So it's about that kind of that power balance of where the listening should be. And I agree with Alison, that should be through hard evidence in court hearings, not just in ancillary processes that don't translate into proper evidential basis. So I just wanted to kind of add that kind of contextual point.
I have, I'm sorry to ask it, and again, this is because I'm not a lawyer, but I wanted to ask Nicola, something was mentioned in the Module 4. I have to look at this. It was the Migrant Primary Care Access Group, and this is to do with parliamentary privilege. Can you tell me what that means?
Yeah, sure. So parliamentary privilege attaches to anything said in Parliament, and that includes the likes of some select committees. And that means that things that are said, you can't then challenge it in other court proceedings. So it protects ministers from suits of slander and libel and things like that. So they can say anything about anyone in the House of Parliament, and they can't be hauled before a court. So it protects open speech, free democracy, that kind of thing, which is great as an idea and as a concept. But the inquiry has asserted parliamentary privilege over things where really it shouldn't be. So the Migrant Primary Access Care Group had put in their Rule 9 response evidence that it had put before the Select Committee, and it wanted to rely on that to say, we raised it back in 2020, so there's no way the government can't say they didn't know about these issues back in 2020, because look, we said it, here's the evidence that we said it to them. And so it seems that there was some misunderstanding, and the inquiry had said you can't do that. It was said at a select committee, therefore parliamentary privilege attaches, so you need to remove it. So rightfully, the group said, this can't be right. We need to have a ruling from the chair. And so yesterday, the chair said, sorry, not yesterday, the day before, on Wednesday, the chair said, I thought all of this had been resolved. So it seems that there's been some correspondence between the inquiry and the group, and the inquiry seem to have accepted that their initial response of thinking privilege attaches was wrong, because all they're wanting to do is to rely on the fact that it was said, not to challenge anything that was said by somebody else. So it's literally just about evidencing we said it to government on this date, therefore from this date they can be taken to have knowledge of this issue. So that seems to have resolved itself quite neatly.
Thank you for explaining that. It's funny because initially looking at the modules, I thought module 4, the vaccination module, might be the least interesting to me because I lost my husband early in the pandemic, and it's a first and second wave before we even had a vaccine that mostly I think about and concerns me. But having sat through the preliminary hearing, I found it fascinating, and I think it's going to be an incredibly interesting module. I learned so much. One of the things I found shocking was the kind of censorship. I mean, I heard scuttlebutt about certain doctors being censored and so on if they had reservations about the vaccination or its development. But one of the things that really surprised me was apparently, I think it might have been the first preliminary hearing for Module 4, and counsel for the vaccine bereaved groups had a video up of the opening submissions. So one of the vaccine bereaved group reposted it from the COVID inquiry website. And YouTube took it down, apparently, saying it was misinformation. And I find it shocking that evidence presented to the inquiry can be treated in this way. Did you hear that? Did you notice that, Nicola or Allison? Did you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I share your shock that something, something like councils, the council's submissions to the inquiry, which the inquiry would happily put on their own website, that YouTube would somehow, and apropos of nothing, it seems, and with no sort of comeback or no sort of discussion prior, would take that down as disinformation, especially when you see what's put on social media and what's put on YouTube. And if we're going to talk about disinformation, I mean, that's really is rich coming from YouTube of all places. I find that kind of, I was shocked. I was also kind of shocked, but by the way that the inquiry didn't seem to be as shocked about it, and didn't seem to be, well, they should have been appalled, because this is a work, this is part and parcel of the inquiry. And for a third party, YouTube, to be deciding, that wider dissemination of this information is not allowed, what does that say? And shouldn't the chair and CTI be worried at least? And they seem to, well, I don't know what the chair thinks, but, certainly CTI seem to just sort of brush it aside, saying, well, there's nothing we can do about it. But
I think it's that, because yes, technically they can't. And it was not the actual inquiries video. It was, I think, someone who was represented who posted it on their own. They hadn't altered it, I don't believe, in any way. But I agree, it was more the attitude. Yes, they can't make you to do anything, but it just seemed like, oh, well. And I think it should be, I don't know. Like I said, I learned a lot, and I think it's going to be a very interesting module. Just another little point of interest that I hadn't thought about. I think it was the BMA. They made their point about community pharmacies administering the vaccine when the program was underway, and they made the point that that government tended not to use existing NHS resources, but rather create these expensive temporary procedures. I just wondered if anyone had any thoughts on that.
No, I thought it's a very interesting point, because pharmacies do a lot more than just simply sell you aspirins. They're during normal times in the winter, they'll give you your flu jab. They will give you advice if especially if it's a local pharmacy that is embedded in the area, and people will know the pharmacist or know the people that work there. And it's resources like that were pre-existing that could have been used, and instead, well, this goes back to the whole module 1 about preparedness and planning, doesn't it? Because if you don't plan properly, then you miss the existing resources, or how you can use, or perhaps sort of change existing resources and to utilize them in a different way. And that just wasn't part of their thinking at all, as there wasn't many other aspects.
No, I understand with some of the, like the Pfizer, the storage, I understand initially that could have been a problem. Now, you can't say this, but I can. But a lot of us who are very cynical and do not trust that government, this government, it's also, I don't know, some of us think it also is an opportunity, a money-making opportunity for someone. Is there anything else anyone wanted to say about Module 4?
The only other thing I'd say about it is that I agree with you. I think that on first blush and just on the papers, you might think it's going to be quite dry module in that. But actually, I think it may well end up being short, but a very lively and a quite a contentious module. And it's interesting that most of the majority of the core participants, we have areas that we overlap, and we're kind of all singing broadly from the same hymn sheet. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that pans out with the witnesses, and how many people are allowed to ask questions. Because, of course, that's going to be very, very tightly restricted now that we've got such a short period of time. And that's worrying, how short it's going to be, because I think they're really underestimating how much time is needed to properly air some of these issues, because they've got a lot of issues in a matter of days, which there's no rationale for why it's been made shorter at all, and if anything, it should have been expanded. So I do think it's going to be a really, really interesting module, though.
I did learn, one of the things I learned, because points were raised, it's been changed to January, and of course this hadn't occurred to me, because many of the vaccine injured, that will simply not be possible for them because it's winter, and traveling will be harder, and their health will be impacted. It's all these things I hadn't thought about. And I think I can say this, that sometimes there seems to be between the COVID bereaved and the vaccine bereaved, there seems to be a bit of, not contention, I don't know why, there just seems to be a tension, let's call it that. And it was really interesting to talk to the vaccine bereaved and injured, and to hear some of their views. And I really, really hope that the COVID bereaved and the vaccine bereaved can work together, because, as you say, Allison, we have so much in common. And I think we can really support each other. So I'm looking forward to getting to know them better when the time comes.
Just picking up on that point, Lorelei, And it comes back to the censorship and the editing of the vaccine impacted group from the previous hearing. I think there seems to be a real sensitivity around anyone who ever mentions vaccines in conjunction with concern. It's read as anti-vax. And it's really important to say that the vaccine impacted group, they are not anti-vax. They are simply saying that it had an impact on them in devastating ways, and they want to explore that in the evidence. What can possibly be wrong with that?
No, I agree. And one of the things I learned talking to them is just the abuse that they get. It's just unjust, unfair. And like I said, I learned a lot. It's kind of humbling to listen to their stories. So Simon Case, I'm happy to say he appeared to be in robust health, except for I think he had a walking stick. I'm glad he seems to have recovered. And interestingly, again, for the bereaved, I noticed he had two people standing either side of him to protect him. This is something we noticed and I've come to this theme before about how our loved ones weren't protected, and yet witnesses are protected, I guess, from us. Anyway. And again, it was very frustrating for us to have to hear him give an apology. He paid tribute to the people who died, but the fact is, I don't know a single bereaved person who wants to hear that. We want evidence, we want truth, we want transparency. We don't want this PR lip service paid to the dead. It seems hypocritical at best. My feeling is it's a shame he didn't give his evidence in situ, and I just wonder what you all thought of that, because it seems watered down, as our memories need to be refreshed of all those extraordinary WhatsApps and so on. And it seemed to me he was taking this opportunity to reframe everything and walk things back. I just wonder if I could come to each of you just in general what you thought of it. I'll come to you first, Anna, because you are Casey.
Yeah, I thought it was frustrating, as you say, that he and a number of other witnesses during Module 2 were allowed a number of minutes at the beginning of their evidence to do sort of a set piece to the chair and to the gallery and to the public at large, when, as we know, Joe and Matt were both prevented from talking about their loved ones in any detail during Module 2. So that feels unfair, that the platform is allowed for some witnesses and curtailed for others. But I agree that sort of the lack of context, the sort of separation of his evidence from the kind of the cut and thrust of Module 2, the heat of Module 2, did allow an opportunity for reflection, hindsight. I felt there was a lot of Dr. Case reflecting and sort of saying, trying to be sort of very forward-looking with things. And because the WhatsApp evidence in particular, it was kind of out of the heat of the context, it did take away some of the impact of them and gave him an opportunity to say, well, that was all very raw and in the present moment, which was, of course, what we heard from other witnesses during Module 2 as well. But part of the strength of the Module 2 evidence was the fact you heard person after person after person say that in a row, which then diminished some of the ability for that kind of line to take hold, if that makes sense. So I thought it was a shame to sort of take it out of context. It lacked a sort of dynamism. It lacked a sort of feeling like it was part of a machine, which of course he is an integral part of the machine that was in operation during the pandemic. And he, like I'm sure anyone in his position, was trying to kind of reflect and sort of reframe and sort of look forward and say, well, this is how processes are working now. Here's how systems are going now. And I think the timing of it really allowed him to focus on that.
I definitely felt that. It was a very polished performance. He was very articulate. I've had people comment to me and seen on social media as well. It's clear he's had months to prepare for this. What did you make of his testimony, Nicola?
It's really interesting to draw a distinction between Wednesday, when the chair told everyone what a serious place this was, and it was for a serious hearing. And then on Thursday, the overall impression was Hugo Keith and Simon Case was like two middle-class mates having a good old chinwag over a whiskey in the Garrick Club. Simon Case was so comfortable at one point, he was even making a joke. Throughout, he often did these little giggles when WhatsApps were put to him, and then he would say, yes, I regret the language I used there. But it was just incredibly frustrating. There was no mention of the role Simon Case played in Partygate. That was just completely whitewashed out of his evidence. The only time he showed any emotion was when he was talking about how hard his colleagues had worked. No doubt that's why they deserved their parties. And anytime he was uncomfortable with a question, we got one of three responses, which was, I wasn't there at the time, I regret the choice of words I used, so soz, or that refrain we've all become used to, I don't remember. Just incredibly frustrating.
Can I just, you're saying that, I was in the hearing room, and I say this as a bereaved person, I had to leave the hearing room at one point because was using too much energy to have to control my emotions. I did not care for the banter, for the wry tone, for the smiles, the raised eyebrows, the winks. I'm not physical winks, but you know what I mean. I just thought, and not only, I mean, the chair seemed to be having a nice time too, in my opinion, with this. And it was just so offensive to me. And so I had to go watch in the viewing room. Nor did I care for the love notes to the former disgraced prime minister, talking about the vaccine rollout to Ukraine, all these things that are considered strengths for the former prime minister, and yet have no relevance to this hearing. And he was allowed to carry on with something that was completely irrelevant.
Even when the Patrick Vallance diary was put to him, where Simon Case is said to have commented that in terms of the inquiry, they want someone like Lord Savile who'll keep it going forever. And therefore, there's never any conclusions or headlines or anything until 10 years hence. And we got his usual response of, oh, I don't remember saying that. And then we just moved on. There was no comeback. There was no real questioning about that. I looked to the chair to see if there was any reaction, but I couldn't see one. But it's important to note at this point that we put in our application last year to question him. It was a joint application with the Northern Ireland team, and our application was refused in its entirety, so we weren't allowed to ask any questions of Simon Case whatsoever.
Yeah, I wanted to come to this because, Anna, it would have been you. If you had been allowed to ask questions, what would you have liked to have asked him that wasn't covered?
So our questions were all kind of on the sort of general themes of inconsistency and sort of the flip-flop and the sort of the relationship between Hancock and his view about Matt Hancock, for example. And so some of those issues, they were covered by counsel to the inquiry. But as Nicola says, it was really how they were covered, which would have been the big and fundamental difference between it. We would have used clear and precise language and made a number of suggestions to him about his views on it, as opposed to allowing him to kind of distance himself from those comments and allowing him to kind of correct himself. And as Nicola said, that sort of the conversation that took place between counsel to the inquiry and Simon Case made him feel very, very comfortable. And that's clearly not what we would have done at all. He would have been more forensically sort of put on the spot about some of those WhatsApps and his actual view at the time and held to them. So that's the frustration. And I'm sure frustration held by the Welsh group and the Northern Irish group as well. So yeah, it would have been sort of a very different tone, as we saw when questions were asked of Johnson and of Sunak last year. So the tone and is important, and the approach is important, and that not letting witnesses be comfortable and feeling this is their space to explain things from their perspective. And giving them the kind of encouraging non-verbal communications that you've touched upon, Lorelei. So yeah, it was really, really frustrating. And he was able to explain things as being sort of cultural issues, and he was able to emphasise the degree to which he's invested in making things different now. And I wonder whether if we heard from other civil servants, whether they would agree that his plan is quite so embedded in sort of future processes. The one thing he did agree with us on is this need for there to be a structure in place permanently that then rolls into action in the time of a crisis like a pandemic. That's been something we've been reiterating throughout our submissions in module 2, throughout our questioning in module 2. We did it in our opening, we did it in our closing, and Lady Hallett put that to him, and he, I think a little patronisingly, said he thought that was a rather good recommendation, and something that he thought was quite a good idea. So great, obviously, but it can't have been the first time he's thought about that. And if it is, why is it the first time he's thought about that? We're now so far since the time of the beginning of the pandemic. Why has that not occurred to him before as the head of the civil service? So that's something we want to sort of reiterate in our final submissions on module 2. But again, it's all very sort of like, oh yes, what a good idea, and oh yes, well, aren't you clever, and let's kind of think about it now in 2024 rather than 2020, 2021, and all the years since. So yeah, really deeply frustrating.
You mentioned that the one thing I noticed as well, and he got away with this, he was asked by, I think it was Hugo Keith, a specific question: how can the civil service prevent this from happening again? And he never answered it. We had those long speeches about Blair, about the Iraq War, things that had no relevance at all. He kept harking back to history as though somehow, I'm not sure if he was saying it was a justification, how things were mismanaged during the pandemic. I'm not sure, but that was really frustrating. And as a bereaved person who has a particular twitch about Partygate, I would like to have seen him questioned about Partygate, because while they were partying, that my husband died without me, and this is, that's why I'm getting emotional even now. I got emotional then. It just triggers me, as the young people say. And he hosted, he was not questioned about how he hosted a party on the same day that SAGE had a meeting about this new variant in December of 2020 on the 17th, about how he was appointed to investigate the Partygate scandal and then had to recuse himself and had to step down because the news came out about his party. He just got away with not even having that referred to. And I just found that horrible. Allison, I haven't come to you yet on what you thought of his testimony.
I think the key word, and Anna and Nicola, and you've all used it, when you watch a witness like him, is comfortable. He should not have felt comfortable. Witnesses like him, and there have been others in other modules, they come along and they are not forensically examined. They are not. I'm not saying that they have to be, literally you shine a light in their eyes and you grill them, but you expect a forensic examination that actually delves and questions properly. But instead, what you get, as Anna says, quite often they're allowed to have this little platform at the beginning where they can do a little mini speech unchallenged, sort of set their stall out. And then there is this coziness and comfortableness, which kind of defeats the purpose of an inquiry. An inquiry is supposed to be rigorous. It's supposed to shine a light on things that have gone wrong. And you don't do that by simply having this very, very cozy chat between counsel and the witness, where there are, as you say, it's all very knowing, and it also feels very exclusive, and it's a way of, I'm sure, for those, not just those in the public gallery, but those watching at home, it becomes like, well, this is literally a club that I'm not a member of and that I don't have access to, and I'm not going to have access to. And whether or not that is something that they meant to do, the perception is there, and the perception is real, and how people feel is real. And sort of watching it myself, even though obviously I'm watching it in a different way because you know the witness and you know I know some of what he was going to say, you can't help but feel that. And that is something that, as I said, he's not the first one that I felt that about is being a lot of them in module 1, a lot of them in module 2, you felt that about. And it was only because Anna and Pete and Leslie and others were able to question them that suddenly they were shaken out of that cozy, comfortable stance and actually had to sort of be challenged. And it was, and just as people were getting going, you'd be sitting there watching it thinking, yes, we're getting somewhere now. And then it's like, ding, 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 your time is up. Your 20 minutes are up. And you just be like, that was really frustrating because quite often, like using Anna's example, quite often Anna would be really getting under their skin. And, and then boom, the guillotine comes down and time's up. But yes, I think comfortable is a word I would use. And it's very, very, very frustrating and very wrong.
I think, and I don't know that the inquiry knows or cares, frankly, that how that kind of breaks the confidence and trust of the core participants, bereaved particularly, and it doesn't instill us with confidence. I know there are a couple of things that I've heard the bereaved talking about and that came up during his testimony. One was eat out to help out. There was this kind of rather extraordinary exchange where Simon Case said he knew nothing about it. And Hugo Keith suggested, was this something just cooked up between Sunak, now Prime Minister, former Chancellor, and former Prime Minister Johnson? And he asked him if he was aware that Whitty and Valance, Chris Whitty and Patrick Valance, hadn't been approached for their view on the scheme. And he said he wasn't aware of it until it was announced, even though, and Hugo Keith said, I think with some kind of astonishment, you were the permanent secretary and you didn't know. So does that seem to you that Boris Johnson versus Sunak just came up with this scheme, encouraging people to go out in public before we had a vaccine, without consulting the scientists or even informing the secretary, the permanent secretary?
I think what he also emphasised in his evidence was the relationship between Johnson and Sunak in terms of the inclination of the then Prime Minister, to follow the advice of Sunak and the need to have people in the room whilst the two of them having their bilaterals to kind of test the proposition that the Chancellor was putting and to kind of create that diversity of thought, I think was the phrase that he used. And that was something that CTI kind of explored with him. Kind of, was there a relationship where the then Chancellor would say something, Sunak would say something, and Johnson would go along with it? And was there kind of too much influence of the Treasury over Johnson? And that's Eat Out to Help Out's a primary example of that, isn't it? Economics was seen to trump considerations of public safety, and we saw it again in the discussion about the reduction of the 2 metre down to 1 metre plus rule, and cases sort of had to accept that the WhatsApps seemed to demonstrate that he was willing to kind of put they were sort of suggesting putting economic interests first, and hence why 1 metre plus was introduced as kind of he didn't call it a step down, but it was being suggested to him that it was a step down. So there is this real kind of insight into that relationship between Johnson and Sunak, and how Johnson was suggested to be sort of in the headlights of Sunak, who would come in with these economic proposals, and decisions would follow from that. So I think that's a really kind of, sort of core part of what was going on at the heart of government at that time, and that's certainly something that's kind of created its own dynamic, I think, within decision making on a number of really, really important topics. Because Sunak, he was the visible face of it, wasn't he? It was he who was handing out meals to members of the public in bars and restaurants. He wanted to own that policy very much so. So, yeah, that's his flagship.
Yes, handing it out unmasked, breathing over people's food. I remember it. I remember it really well. And that kind of leads on to the other thing that I suppose I knew it. Sometimes you don't know it until you actually hear it. And it was when they talked about how test and trace didn't work, and the second lockdown didn't work. And it was because the incidence of the virus was so high in this country, because we opened up so much earlier than other places. And as I was hearing this, I thought, God, revisiting this is traumatic. No, not only for people who lost people in that second wave, but for those who lost in the first wave, because it feels like the deaths of our loved ones were wasted, if you like. They couldn't even be learned from to help prevent that second wave. And I'd forgotten that we did open up earlier. I just wondered if anyone had any thoughts on this. I'm sorry, I'm being a bit woolly about it, but about the test and trace and lockdown, second lockdown.
Yeah, I think the evidence that suggested that at all stages, the ability to control the virus overwhelmed our ability to provide test and trace, whether that was in the first wave or the second wave. We were never at a point where we could have successfully mitigated and controlled through test and trace, whether that's because of lack of preparedness in the first wave and inadequate ability to roll out materials and testing provision. And then, as you say, the lack of learning that went into that interim period between the first and second lockdown. It was always kind of the tail wagging the dog.
One thing, he was asked what the civil service is doing now. I think Lady Hallett asked toward the end of his testimony, Simon Case's testimony, and how one can increase the importance of preparedness and spending money on things that are glamorous in that way. And I have to say, when Simon Case said, through structures and transparency, I gave a hollow laugh. What did anyone think of his responses?
I think one of the most interesting interactions between Hugo Keith and Dr. Simon Case was when he was asked about his use of the word review, because in a WhatsApp, when Simon Case had referred to his own review, he put it in inverted commas. Now, my understanding of when you do that is you're being sarcastic in the use of the word. So I might say what lovely summer weather we have whilst it's pouring outside and put the word summer in inverted commas. So he had chosen to put the word review in inverted commas. And interestingly, Hugo Keith said to him, "Did you do that because this was a put-up job?" And the chair rode in on a white horse to protect Dr. Case from such an assertion, said it was an unfair question. Now, this was all about a review into whether we could safely reduce the 2-metre social distancing to 1 metre social distancing. And Simon Case said the evidence for the fact that it wasn't a put-up job was the fact that he didn't recommend a 1 metre social distance. What he recommended was 1 metre plus, which means 1 metre with mitigations. Now, to me, that just sounds like 1 metre. But there's just this extraordinary skill to use language in a way that, to me, is plain manipulation. And I think we saw that a few times in his evidence.
That's Allison's point as well, isn't it, about language being used to create exclusivity and to create hierarchy. And that's something that witnesses need to be reminded of, I think, throughout this inquiry. And also counsel, any counsel, I include everybody in that, needs to be careful of too. It does create this space, whether it's an exclusive space for people to communicate to those who they consider to be in the know, whether that's the chair or counsel to the inquiry, in sort of code, and it allows them to manipulate a plain understanding of a situation, as Nicola's just exemplified there as well. So I think everyone needs to be mindful about using plain language, saying what they think, asking a direct question, not, I was going to say obfuscate, and then I was going to fall into my own trap by using language. But we do it all the time, don't we? We do, as lawyers, we do it all the time. And one thing we try really hard to do, Allison, Peter, and I, and all of us involved, is to try and avoid those uses of language that can create those barriers, but they're important to identify and pick up on when others do them, and to really kind of unpack them, because they're part of transparency.
I agree. And I think, because I believe Lady Hallett and Simon Case had a lovely little debate about Whitehall-Lees and how impenetrable it was, while at the same time using the language that you've described.
But the the words they were unpacking were extremely clinical vulnerable. And I'm thinking, well, that's not that difficult to understand. It might have a scientific meaning that maybe I don't know, as I'm not a clinician, but I didn't find that particular use of language to be that difficult to understand compared to his discussion of trying to discuss the anthropology of the civil service. I was thinking, I know what anthropology means, I think, but what would the anthropology of the civil service be? So it was an odd choice of example to use as to of Whitehallese. There's air quotes, there's acronyms, there's shorthand, and the WhatsApps were just even quicker ways of sending across those shorthands and those understood codes between individuals who are in the know.
I wonder if I could, I'm just so grateful that you've all taken this time to talk to us, but I wonder if I could come to each of you for maybe your last thoughts on this week's testimony in both these modules, or your standout moment. Allison?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, Module 4, I think, is going to be far more lively, far more engaging than people are thinking on the papers, because it's for many people, many of the different core participants as well, it's very pressing. Time literally is of the essence for people. And I don't think, again, that the inquiry quite get that. So I'm really looking forward to it for that aspect of it. But as I said, I can anticipate people are going to be very frustrated as well because of the way it's been concertinaed down in terms of time. And we're going to get this parade of witnesses rush through. And either it's going to mean, if we want them to be a little bit longer in their evidence, you know what that's going to mean. It's going to mean that we're not going to be allowed any questions. So that's going to be the trade-off. Either they'll give us, a few questions, or they'll just make us have no questions or very few at all, so that they can have a little bit longer with the witnesses. And with Mr. Case, just a final thought on him. You know what annoys me about civil servants and government ministers and Whitehall generally is that, yes, it is, it's not necessarily straightforward, but neither is it as complicated, and their systems are not as complicated as they want us to believe. And they want us to think that this is such a different world, that, it's an exclusive world. You wouldn't really understand it, and again, that sort of puts up that barrier between them and us. You don't really understand this. You mean there are even acronyms that you probably don't really understand. So therefore, we can talk about these things in these, sort of very obscure way, exclude other people. And then again, it becomes very cozy and exclusive to those in the know. And that's what I really dislike about those type of witnesses. And you see that again and again in different inquiries and it's interesting, again, between different inquiries, how much that is challenged and how much that is not challenged or allowed to be challenged. But that's my sort of final thought on Mr. Case, other than the fact, as Anna and Nicola said, it's unfortunate when you take a witness out of the milieu of of the actual other witnesses, because then you lose momentum. They have time to sit down, reflect, re-look at other witnesses, re-look at what's been going on, reframe their whole presentation. And obviously, that's something that he was able to do.
That's absolutely clear. Okay. And Anna, go ahead, your final thoughts or standout moments, please.
I think the first thing chronologically is the distinction between the comfort levels on Wednesday in Module 4 and the comfort levels for the counsel inquiry on Thursday in Module 2. We've talked a bit about kind of some of the tensions in the room during the Module 4 preliminary hearing, and how uncomfortable both the chair and CTI were at some of the submissions that were made. But in Module 2, I think the level of comfort and ease that Simon Case felt during his evidence was in quite stark contrast to that. The reasons we kind of touched on. But I think my most surprising moment came right at the end of his evidence, and Hugo Keith was sort of asking him to kind of reflect on some of the tumult of the Johnson administration and some of his sort of experiences of that. And I was in that moment sort of very aware that we were sitting here on the 23rd of May, with a general election having just been called for the 4th of July, with the most senior civil servant in the country still serving, and bearing in mind that civil servants have got a mandate not to speak about political matters and not to show any favour to any political party. They've been asked to reflect on the characteristics and personalities of several prime ministers, one still serving, and had chosen to comment about a previous prime minister from a different administration in 1997. And then was asked the final question, isn't it fair to say that you get what you vote for? To which he said yes. So as a sort of moment of high politics, meeting law and meeting evidence, I thought that's quite remarkable, actually, 6 weeks before a general election, to be hearing that evidence and it being posed by the inquiry. I mean, no criticism of the question being posed, but I just thought, what a moment to be, what a legal political moment to sit there. And of course, it's absolutely right. You do get what you vote for.
And lastly, Nicola, your thoughts on this week's module.
I'm afraid my overall thought is just one of disappointment. Disappointment that we've still got the obsession with timekeeping, regardless of how much time we have left in the day. We've still got an incredibly short period given to both the Module 3 and Module 4 hearings, just 11 days for the Module 4 hearings. And massive disappointment that we've ended Module 2 with such a comfortable loving between the witness and the inquiry, with no real forensic analysis that would have happened had he been called when he should have been.
I agree. And as Anna points out, especially, I don't know, this close to an election, I agree. Thank you. Thank you all so much for being here with us. And we're going to see you, I guess, in September. What are we back next for, Nicola? What are we opening with?
There is a preliminary hearing on the 27th of June. That is on Module 7. But in terms of the podcast, we will be back in September when Module 3 starts. We don't have even a provisional witness list for Module 3 yet. So watch this space.
Thank you so much, Allison and Anna and Nicola, as always. Just such a privilege to talk with you all.
Thanks for listening to this instalment of the COVID Inquiry podcast. We hope you found it insightful and interesting. If you did, please rate us on the podcast platform you use and share the pod with friends and family who may value this type of commentary. We're looking forward to you joining us next week for more expert commentary, opinion, and insight into the COVID Inquiry evidential hearings.